What happens when a community's wastewater facility is not invested in is that you end up having overflows and you end up having surface water. And it's just gross. Frankly, when you have a wastewater facility that is not meeting standards, you cannot bring new economic opportunities into that community because you don't have the ability to treat the water that you currently have.
Welcome to the Level Design Podcast, a podcast for architects and engineers who want to thrive in this industry by creating more freedom, fulfillment, and financial security. Join us in uncovering how to restore value and honor to the unique people who choose to be designers and caretakers of our built world, and why it's essential to the future of our society, our industry, and our planet.
So I am the commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And so this is the state equivalent of the EPA. And there is one of these in every state. They have different names. In some states, it's called the Department of Environmental Quality. Some states called the Department of Environmental Protection. In Minnesota, the people who had eminent wisdom working with the legislator many, many years ago decided they were going to be different and call it something else. So we are called the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. But our mission is to protect human health and the environment. And what we do is we carry out federally delegated authorities and authorities that have been given to us from the state legislature. And at the federal level, that includes the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, as well as RCRA, which is the solid waste, Superfund, hazardous waste type regulations. In Minnesota, we have a separate Department of Health, and they carry out the Safe Drinking Water Act. So they oversee the community water supplies, but we work very closely with them, as well as with the Department of Agriculture at the state level and the Department of Natural Resources. In each state is organized a little bit differently, but in Minnesota, the agency that I oversee has about 1,000 people, and we have offices in 7 different parts of the state. Minnesota is about the size of Germany. We have 6 regional offices, and the hub office where I'm located is in St. Paul, Minnesota, the capital. But because our work serves the state of Minnesota, we have to be in places across the state because we have people every day who, in their work to carry out the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, are in the field. They're monitoring water, they're collecting air samples, they're conducting inspections of permitted facilities, they're engaging with local partners. A lot of our work includes tribes.
What's a permitted facility, Katrina?
Yeah, so under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and under the solid waste regulations that the federal government delegated us, and we have separate permitting authorities that come from the state of Minnesota, if facilities operate above a certain threshold, they need a permit. So in Minnesota, we permit wastewater discharges to waters of the state. And that includes underground, so groundwater discharges. So if you have a septic system or a large community underground system that uses soil-based treatment, that requires a permit, as well as ponds, wastewater ponds that rely on mostly natural biology, chemistry, and physics, and wind and sun to move water and store water until the bacteria have done their piece. And then also small and large wastewater treatment plants that serve both municipalities and industrial facilities. So we have probably 1,200 wastewater permit holders in the state of Minnesota. Of that number, about 800 or so are municipalities. So this is different than Germany, where you have a lot of regionalization and you have more density and you've got giant, sophisticated wastewater facilities that serve, hundreds of thousands of people. Many, many communities in Minnesota are less than 5,000, and they have permits for their wastewater. So that's like the universe of wastewater permits. So the Clean Water Act has a goal of eliminating pollutant discharges to waters of the U.S. And so the way that they do that and authorize states and tribes to do that is to give permitting authority. And so we have engineers and permit writers who work with these municipalities and industries to make sure that their discharge to the surface waters or the groundwater isn't violating standards. So that is the permitting authority or the permitting work that we do on the water side.
So for Miles, there's a word that we throw around, the waters of the United States. So Miles, are you following what that is?
I think I am following, yes.
Well, and Miles, that's so like the Supreme Court has tried to define this, and the EPA under different leadership has flip-flopped back and forth what actually qualifies as a water of the US. In Minnesota, we also have to permit discharges to waters of the state, and the definition within the state of Minnesota is much broader than the various definitions that the US government has considered depending on who is in charge. So for our purposes, things like I talked about groundwater, ditches also constitute waters of the state. Wetlands are waters of the state. Depending on which version of the Clean Water Act and the EPA is in charge, they will say things like it has to be connected. There has to be a clear connection to and it has to be navigable. So like you could take your boat up. So if like you could not navigate a boat in an intermittent stream, otherwise known as a ditch, if there wasn't enough flow, certain versions of the EPA over time would not call that a waters of the US. But it doesn't really apply where I live because our definition is much broader. But it is very relevant in certain parts of the state or in certain parts of the United States, particularly where they are less water rich. And certain parts of Colorado and certainly the Western United States have different water rights and water regulations because of the nature of water scarcity.
Katrina, do you have more of a challenge because Minnesota is known as the land of 10,000 lakes? Do you have more of a challenge than, say, an arid climate like Colorado or Utah or the western states?
Well, I think we have a different scope of work. So one of the things that we do, one of the authorities under the Clean Water Act is to monitor and assess waters for meeting standards. So we have a lot of people whose job it is to go during the field season, spring, summer, and fall, to be out in the field, and they're taking chemistry samples and they're taking biology samples, so both micro and macro invertebrates, and they're sampling fish. It's a great summer job if you like fishing. And then during the non-field season part of the year, these people will look at data and they will decide based on the standards that have been adopted in Minnesota under our Clean Water Act and state authorities, whether or not this creek or this reach of river is meeting the standards. And we have 80 watersheds in the state of Minnesota. And we have, I'm not going to get this right, Murray, but we have well more than 10,000 lakes, depending on what size of lake you're talking about. And the Mississippi River starts in Minnesota. We have 3 other very large rivers. We are the headwaters of the Red River that goes to Canada. We are the headwaters of the Great Lakes because we have Lake Superior that ultimately ends up at the Great Lakes or the St. Lawrence Seaway and out in the Atlantic Ocean. And we are the headwaters of the Mississippi. So we have a lot of responsibility in Minnesota for many, many millions of people who drink water that originates in Minnesota and live in different states and frankly, provinces in different countries as well.
Does the federal government see that importance in terms of the Supreme Court decisions and where they see Minnesota as essentially a water provider for a lot of the country?
I think it depends on who is in charge of the federal government. I think there are compacts between Canada and the United States, for example, that we and other Great Lakes states, and in the case of the Red River, North Dakota and Minnesota, and the province of Winnipeg and Manitoba we have to carry those out. We have to show up with elected people from the federal government, from the Canadian federal government, and make sure that water we're sending to Canada is meeting standards and that everybody in North Dakota, Minnesota, and in Manitoba are doing their part to make sure that no one population is getting disproportionately impacted by somebody else's negligence of not properly treating water, for example. There are pots of federal money that go to the Great Lakes that are uniquely available to states in the Great Lakes to do some of the work that I've talked about. And I will say that the Great Lakes Restoration Fund, which is the fund that pays for work in Lake Superior and all of the other Great Lakes for the most part, is universally popular amongst Congress. I think people like the Great Lakes. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I think they see that not only the iconic beauty and recreational value of those lakes, but they see the economic part of it. For example, in Minnesota, we have taconite. So that's mining ore and turning it into the precursor to steel. That is one of the commodities that is readily shipped out of the Duluth port in Minnesota. And there's some smaller ports up the North Shore of Minnesota as you head towards Michigan and Wisconsin. And there is also a lot of grain that moves back and forth out of the Minnesota port to other parts of the world, frankly. That comes with its own challenges. There's a lot of concerns over aquatic invasive species that can be transported through ballast water. So let's just say you're coming from Asia and you're bringing empty ship to Duluth to pick up soybeans or taconite pellets. Then you have to empty the ballast in order to take on the cargo to balance out the load. And the ballast water will potentially include organisms that we don't have in Lake Superior that they do have in some of the other lakes and frankly in other parts of the world, which can wreak havoc on natural ecosystems. So we also have historically had a ballast water permitting program in Minnesota, which was preempted by a federal rule, I don't know, probably 7 years ago now. So now the federal government is saying we will develop a universal ballast water permitting system that everyone across the Great Lakes will adhere to. In these types of situations, it's hard because Canada has different standards than the United States. So ships that move back and forth from Canada to Minnesota or to Ohio or Michigan are subject to different standards on different parts of the border. So that's less than ideal. But I think coming back to what is the value of like a Clean Water Act, it's having a consistent backstop across the country by which if you operate in Austin, Texas, let's just say you're running an ethanol facility. I don't even know if they have ethanol in Texas as part of their economy. In Minnesota, if you're running an ethanol facility, the air permit that you're issued in Texas and in Minnesota would be the same theoretically, except, sometimes there's some local differences. But for the most part, the air and water and land regulations that are set by the federal government should apply universally across the country so that there is a fair playing field for businesses and the economics are mostly the same.
Miles, did you feel the complexity of what's going on behind the scenes with government and regulations and protecting your drinking water and natural rivers and streams?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, we talk about it in engineering and infrastructure all the time where, you don't really hear about it until something goes wrong. So it's kind of like the, unsung heroes of infrastructure. And this is another angle of it that I didn't know really anything about, water, wastewater. We rely on it and we're affected by it in so many ways that I'm starting to piece together. But there's so much that goes into maintaining the quality. Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. I'm really curious what might be a broad question, but what are some of the bigger challenges that you're facing right now in your work?
Yeah. Well, I think related to the water world, across the country that municipal governments and communities are facing the challenge of paying for aging infrastructure. And I highlighted the fact that we have hundreds of small wastewater facilities in Minnesota. That is not unique to Minnesota. There are states across the country where there are 1,000, 2,000 people, sometimes hundreds of people served by a wastewater treatment plant that was built 50 plus years ago, that was built to meet standards that applied 50 years ago and flows that were relevant 50 years ago. And we know that pipes leak over time. And we know that the storms and frequency of intense rains have changed and become larger in the last 50 years. So the challenges facing those wastewater facilities are immense in terms of overflows and leaky pipes and meeting standards. And some of the standards that we think about here in Minnesota most readily are, nutrients, both phosphorus and nitrogen. You don't want to have harmful algal blooms. You don't want to have blue-green algae in the lakes. That's very bad for dogs and humans and drinking water. But it also applies to rivers. We, as I noted, are the upstream to all of the Gulf states. And 20 million people drink water from the Mississippi River. And if you have too many nutrients in the water, you can end up with microcystin or a condition where you cannot drink the water. And then who pays for that? So I think meeting these standards, having a realization of who's contributing the pollutants. Some of it's human made from, digestion, but some of it is non-point source runoff. and some of it is industry. So fairly apportioning costs for upgrading wastewater treatment facilities, I think, is a huge challenge because the community and the tax base in many of these communities cannot pay for water treatment plant that removes microcystin or a wastewater facility that addresses things like PFAS on its own. And the federal government doesn't appear to be coming to save them. So the question of economics and is it viable to continue to have this many small wastewater and water treatment facilities across the country, I think is very relevant. In addition to age and climate change and standards, I think workforce is a huge challenge. If you need 800 wastewater treatment operators,
Right.
you better be training 800 wastewater treatment operators because all of those facilities cannot just have one operator. And many of them have worked there for decades and they would like to retire at some point. So succession planning and compensation and making this a function and profession where people see themselves and providing a critical essential service, I think is a part of the work that we should all be doing and promoting that and supporting education and mentorship and programs that bring up operators and people who can understand how to operate 50-year-old wastewater facilities and then think about conceptualizing what does wastewater treatment look like into the future so that we have people who can help design and build and then run wastewater treatment plants that do meet some of those challenges that we were talking about.
What do you see, Katrina? If we don't match these needs, what do you see?
Well, what happens when a community's wastewater facility is not invested in is that you end up having overflows and you end up having surface water or groundwater that isn't meeting standards, and you can have fish kills or you can have boil water advisories, and it's just gross. And at the same time, people want to be prideful of their community and their assets in their community. So I think it does a disservice to the people who have decided that they want to live in small communities that are vibrant hubs for economic and other reasons. And frankly, when you have a wastewater facility that is not meeting standards, you cannot bring new economic opportunities into that community, like a new ethanol plant, which uses a lot of water and has a water discharge, because you don't have the ability to treat the water that you currently have at your wastewater. So it is a hindrance for economic opportunities as well.
Look at agriculture as probably one of your biggest non-point source pollutants, because you have the four-pronged fork. You have urban, you have commercial, industrial, and agriculture as the main components of wastewater pollutants. How do you deal with all of that?
So the Clean Water Act exempts agricultural runoff from the permitting programs. So I mentioned that the Clean Water Act has one goal that says eliminating discharges of pollutants to navigable or to waters of the U.S. And they had a date in the Clean Water Act, like 1986 or something. So obviously we've passed that, but we still have to operate the permitting programs. And that provision of the Clean Water Act says that agricultural runoff is exempt from permitting. So the levers that we have as the Clean Water Act delegated authority, which include, understanding what pipes need to come out of wastewater facilities and what treatment units need to be in wastewater facilities to address phosphorus and nitrogen and, organic matter and other industrial pollutants that might be coming to a community. Those do not exist for agricultural runoff. And so what we have to do is look at all of the data that we have as a state under the entirety of the water program. So I talked about the monitoring and assessing, and you have this map of data that essentially points to, we have too much phosphorus here. How do we get less phosphorus? Well, we know we have 5 wastewater treatment plants that discharge here. So we will assign 5 wastewater treatment plants phosphorus limits. Well, we can apportion out how much is actually coming from the wastewater treatment plants because we can measure the flow and the concentration, and what's in the water. And then that the balance of it is coming from somewhere else. And in many cases in Minnesota and in other parts of the United States where you don't have a lot of urban centers, stormwater does contribute phosphorus, but that it's coming from non-point sources like agriculture. And when you don't have the ability to write permits and to control that, you have to work through other mechanisms. And just to be super frank, that includes incentives and education And we have gotten better at that. In Minnesota, where agriculture is a giant engine, we regularly meet with like the corn growers and the soybean growers and the dairy folks and the cattle and the turkey and chicken and pork. And we talk about the data that we have that show where the pollutants are coming from. And this includes, I'll say, climate change conversations where we know where we have carbon emissions and carbon sequestration opportunities. And they want to do better. They don't want us to regulate them, but they want to do better. So they would like giant incentive checks to do things like controlled drainage. And that can be holding water back when you know that you're going to have more impact from nutrients that might be coming from tile drains, for example. It also includes a lot of precision agriculture and changes in tilling practices so that you don't lose as much of the nitrogen, for example, that you're applying as fertilizers, which is very expensive. Nobody wants to needlessly have to go out and buy the inputs for their small business to know that they are just getting washed away in a drain tile downstream to pollute Iowa's drinking water. So there's a lot of different programs, I'll say, at the state level and also at the federal level to think about changing the way we incentivize commodities. But that is a very big system. Like if you are a corn farmer and you're getting paid to grow corn, someone comes and says, well, why don't you grow oats? Because oats are better for the water and better for the soil. Well, then who's going to buy your oats? And what are they going to pay you? And is there crop insurance for your oats? And is it long-term an option if you see yourself as, turning this over to your next generation? Corn seems pretty attractive in those options because corn has a whole economy and a world economy that is built on corn. So we talk a lot about working with the University of Minnesota, with the commodity groups, with the crop advisors. You have to work the entire system to develop markets and to develop willingness on the part of, frankly, the farmers who are small business owners to take risks that otherwise they wouldn't be asked to take.
Looking for a new opportunity? Interested in being part of an expanding network of independent engineers and architects who are thinking differently? Level Design Partners is on a mission to create prosperity for design professionals, the industry, and the world, using innovative business systems and a culture of collaboration. We believe that traditional education and firm structures want you to be a cog in their machine, depriving you of key skills needed to thrive, thus commoditizing an entire industry in the process. Gain access to skills, tools, and systems by partnering with Level Design Partners. Learn more at leveldesignpartners.com.
So we've talked mostly about water, but what else is there that you're focusing on pollution-wise?
Yeah, so we have the authority for the Clean Air Act here, and I know less about the air side, but I will say there's a whole host of different types of air permits that different sizes of facilities have to have. And unlike water, we have all sorts of standards and understanding of treatment units like scrubbers and filters that remove things like mercury or particulate matter and nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide that would be produced in mining or food processing or chemical manufacturing, refining, all of which exists here in Minnesota. And so those permits also require regular revisiting. And if like the water and air permits both are 5-year terms. So every 5 years you have to come in and you have to make sure that you are meeting standards and that if new and you've been in compliance and that if something new is needed, that it's added. We're pretty good at that. There's a huge body of emission sources that are not regulated, and those are the cars. So when you think about ozone or particulate matter, which cause asthma and health disparities in Minnesota and smog, frankly, I mean, you guys are familiar with smog inversions. We don't have it as much here in where we don't have mountains, but because of wildfires, we have air alerts now that we've never had before. And we know that we're doing a good job controlling the point sources, the stationary emitting sources, but vehicles are a huge component of air quality. So not unlike the water side, we also have to think about what mechanisms we have on the air side to deal with non-point sources. And frankly, it's very similar. It's like education and outreach and making choices available about getting around in different ways and making those choices affordable. So working with people who promote transit and electric vehicles and the infrastructure that is needed to support those things, all of that is part of our work on the air side as well.
Is methane regulated at all, Katrina?
Yes, from stationary sources, methane is regulated. So, and methane coming from cows, methane coming from manure is not regulated. So, we have a lot of science now around the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced in the state of Minnesota. We also have goals in statute now. We are going to be carbon free by 2050. A lot of that will come from the electricity sector, where we are on track to be carbon neutral by 2040. But Marie, that's a really good point, because methane is 4 times more powerful than CO2 alone. And many of the methane sources are not controlled. So part of the conversation around climate change and air quality is, what levers do we have in order to have less methane? And a lot of that comes from municipal solid waste too. So landfills emit a lot of methane, and new landfills are capturing methane, and it can be cleaned and returned into renewable natural gas. We have a lot of landfills in the United States and in Minnesota that are just holes in the ground with a cover, and they are leaking methane uncontrolled. So we are doing a lot around incentivizing composting and encouraging communities to think about digesters and potentially partnering with dairy, who need a lot of work on methane. And manure is a challenge. Manure is a commodity in that it can be a supplement to or a replacement for nitrogen fertilizer, which is extremely expensive. But you can only apply it during certain times of the year, or it runs off into the water and causes all of the problems we've already talked about. So if you could store your manure and your compost or your organics from a food industry in a digester, it's storage, number one. So it helps you meter out the time by which you would apply things to crops. And it also is a more reliable way to digest the organic material so that you can control the emissions. And it is a more consistent and reliable amendment to soil and crops than into the future. But we don't have very many of these in Minnesota right now. And part of our climate change work, and frankly, our air work and our work with agriculture, is around, should we be thinking about methane as a resource and something that can be turned into electricity, and also bring strange bedfellows together with regards to different sources of organic material that would otherwise just leak methane into the air.
Wow. So it's obviously so complex. There's so many different areas that we could explore, but just to keep things somewhat high level, I'm curious if you have anything, knowing what you know, the kind of work that you're doing, what would you want someone like myself, or just someone who's not in this world, just a normal person, normal civilian out there, causing pollution, using up the resources, using up infrastructure, and being in this country ignorant to all these things? What would you want them to know? And is there anything that they can do to make a meaningful impact?
Well, yes, there are many things that humans can do. I am optimistic about the possibilities in front of us with regards to all of these challenges. And I think part of it is just starting to talk about, where does your water come from? Even knowing if you got a letter from the city of Austin that says you live on a block that includes lead pipes, this is what this means for you. Talk to your neighbors, talk to people who represent you at the local level, and then think about where your water goes. Where's the wastewater treatment plant that serves you? And also, where does your stormwater go? In Minnesota, we like to talk a lot about connections to water, and people love opportunities to fish and swim and be in boats and think about their identity very closely to water and experiences around water. And the runoff from your front lawn or your curb or your street or your farm certainly goes to those those sources of recreational opportunities without treatment for the vast majority of cases. And as somebody who swims in lakes all the time, I think about this and I talk about it with people, probably because it's my job, but also because I think Minnesotans really care about water. And I think that's not unique to Minnesota. So I think just starting to talk to people about it. And then there's other choices that you can make as an individual. Composting it makes a big difference. And many places in this country now offer curbside composting. And you can actually compost at your house. It doesn't have to be gross. It doesn't have to be inside your house. Those things can make a big difference. And then in as much as you have the resources to think about other ways to get electricity or to have transit, those are other things that I think individuals can talk about and talk to people who have capacity to make a change at the local level or at the state level and support those things. Not everybody can go out and buy an EV. They're extremely expensive and it doesn't work for everybody. I just got a used EV and I have yet to get my level 2 charger installed at my house. And everyone's like, we got to get before the winter because you will never be able to drive anywhere in the winter if you don't have a level 2 charger at your house. And that's all super expensive and out of reach for many people. I mean, it'd be awesome if we could all go out and get a heat pump installed, but those are tens of thousands of dollars. And just like other systems we've talked about, the heating system in most of this country is based on fossil fuels. So there are small changes that individuals can make around weatherization and insulation and thinking about transit when you can, or taking fewer trips, or just understanding where your water and wastewater come from and go. And the other thing I'll say that makes a huge difference is where you get your food, because food comes from all over the world. And that's great. I'm not saying that people should not eat strawberries in the winter, but just understanding where it's coming from and making informed choices. And when you have choices of buying food that is locally sourced in Colorado or in Texas or in Minnesota, why not choose that? Because you're supporting your local economy and some business owner who has chosen to locate in the state where you live, as opposed to somebody else who is growing food in another part of the country or the world. And then the footprint of carbon that is associated with flying that food across the world is significant. And the water that it takes to produce that food and to produce the fuel to fly that food across the world is significant. So I think those are the biggest areas where people as individuals can make a difference within their household and within their community.
Well said.
Miles, what was the biggest topic you had conversation this last weekend with your friends? What was the biggest item of conversation?
Life of a showgirl?
Yes.
But seriously, you asked what could you do differently? And this is really what we should be talking about is what did you guys talk about the biggest topic this weekend?
Well, I think something that comes up more frequently now is, there is a lot of doom and gloom out there, right? It's just easy to fall down that rabbit hole, but AI just keeps popping up. And it's exciting and this new thing and it's great. And it's also really scary. And the more I hear about the drain on our resources that AI is actually causing is really scary. The amount of water, the amount of energy to run these huge...
artificial and thinking, yeah.
The hyper data centers. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big deal everywhere. And one thing that I would say to people who are thinking about this is, and I've heard corporate leaders of Google and Amazon and Meta say this, that they want to be good stewards of the resources. I think this is here to stay. So we need to find a way to live with this. And as much as individuals and in conversations with your friends or within your household or your community can articulate that, yeah, this is useful. I see it personally. My children who go to high school use this. My husband, who is also an engineer, uses this in his work all the time. It's here to stay. But as we can articulate that we want standards that encourage or require water reuse or closed loop systems for water, and renewable energy, then what's Google or Amazon going to do when the whole country is saying, yeah, we want you to come here, but you got to adhere to our values. And you, corporate X, Y, and Z entity, also have stewardship values that you espouse to. So let's all live our values in a way that manifests economic opportunity and continued AI, but also includes responsible uses of energy and water, which is possible it is possible. And I think it's kind of sneaky right now, the way that data centers are trying to get into communities. I don't know, you are a consultant, so you probably see it a different way, but we don't hear about it until after there sometimes are some local dealing where some entity will come in and say, well, we want to buy this giant parcel in your community, and we will bring this number of construction jobs and this number of, economic infusion into your local economy, at least for the short term. And by the way, we are this entity and we want to use your water supply too. So what we're trying to do here, and this is including with legislators, is develop a framework that really incentivizes people to locate where there's plenty of water, and with the expectation that renewable energy needs to be the starting point. And if you can, for some reason, demonstrate why it's not available to you, which makes no sense, because if you were building a giant building, you could at least put the solar on the roof and then put in some batteries next to your facility. Then we'll have that conversation with you. But I think this is one example where two things can be true at the same time. We can be environmentally responsible and we can be users and supporters of AI.
Well said. It definitely makes me feel a little bit better that there is a way through this. It's obviously going to be bumpy. We're at the beginning of this and it's a little crazy right now. And there's probably a lot of shortcuts being taken, unfortunately. But
I'm just curious if this weekend coming up, if you asked your friends or your circle of peers that, hey, let's cut funding for AI compared to cutting funding for the EPA, what's going to be the vote? If I got to cut somewhere, let's pause AI or let's pause the EPA.
Well, yeah, I don't know anyone personally who is kind of like pro AI. Everyone I know is obviously, it's a cool tool and a lot of people I know use it. There's that thing, but more people are afraid of the future and the impacts on the planet than the other side. I think unless you're like a part of one of these companies, it's a really exciting opportunity if you're in it. I mean, it's like a gold rush. Like people are going crazy over it. But I think people are more hesitant about it and fearful.
I think healthy skepticism is good in this case.
For sure. I agree.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, Scott, the EPA has 5 pillars under the current administration. And one of them is make the United States the AI capital of the world. So don't worry. The EPA is promoting AI and they will make sure it happens. I'm serious. You can look it up. It's all over in documents.
Katrina, is there a consensus across the board from those that are excited about AI, the developers, and ultimately the users, that there has to be some sort of commitment to the environment in doing this? That's the thing. There has to be a commitment.
Well, I have heard that from the leaders of Google and Amazon who say their job is AI stewardship. I will say the one example we had in Minnesota where an Amazon facility was trying to locate here, it didn't play out that way. And I called that out when I had the opportunity. So I think we all need to be, well, certainly people in my position need to be aware that these corporations have said that this is their goal. And we need to make sure that that plays out in the realization of these projects.
Yeah. And is there anything from the perspective of an engineer, the designers, infrastructure, water, wastewater in particular, is there anything that you would want them to know? Or I don't know how y'all collaborate, how that works, but is there anything that we should know about that interaction and collaboration?
Well, we work really closely with consultant engineers at the MPCA. So most new or expanded wastewater air facilities, industrial facilities that are coming into Minnesota hire a consultant. And they will lean on that consultant to help them navigate the regulatory process. They will often fill out the permit application for the air permit or for the water permit, and then be the primary point of contact as our air permit or water permit engineers review the application and have questions about design units or size of different treatment options, and talking about standards and how those will translate to limits. Because many companies do not have a environmental engineer on staff who can serve in that capacity. And they don't need to have that, frankly, because they only need it once every X number of years when they're expanding or when they're going through a permitting process. So they rely on people like you all to serve in that capacity. And one thing I would say is that we really appreciate early conversations in the inception conversations. And this certainly applies to the data centers. Like, as soon as somebody wants to come to Minnesota, they should be talking to, the Department of Employment Economic Development about like, what incentives do you have and how can we talk about the economic opportunity? And also the Pollution Control Agency, who says, here's what this looks like in Minnesota. Here's the path, so that everybody has realistic expectations and knows who to call and knows how long it's going to take. And if we need to move faster, who to have that conversation with too. So I would say early and often engineer interactions make all of this go better. And then the other thing I would say is responsiveness. So some consultants, engineers have like 10 projects you're working on, which is great. That's great for you. But when the MPCA says, hey, we're missing this air modeling calculation, and then it takes 3 weeks for us to get that information back, that's really hard because we also have air engineers who could be working on many things. And when they're waiting on consultants, that is an inefficient use of state resources. And we are held to certain standards around timeliness and how long things take. And everybody wants everything to move faster. And we are trying to develop relationships with consultants so that they understand we can only move as fast as they are also moving. And then quality information. You don't want to submit crap because that doesn't make you look good. It doesn't make us feel good. And it just makes everything take longer. So coming with creativity early and often, whether you're talking about water reuse in a data center or solar power and what the permitting process looks like for that, we're all in for that. And we've got a lot of smart people who've worked here for their entire career and they went to school for engineering, very dedicated to this mission. And they really like that back and forth and that problem solving. You just need people on the other side of the table who are also willing to engage in that.
Well said. Katrina, thank you. I mean, I feel like we could keep going.
She's full of information, isn't she?
Yeah. And it's just such a complicated, it sounds like a very complex world that you're working in. And it's so important and it affects so many people. And I've learned a lot. And I hope other people will learn a lot because it's important stuff.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. Nice to see you, Murray and Scott, and nice to meet you, Miles. And, always happy to talk to people, particularly young people who are thinking about this as a career or what it means to work for a state government versus a private entity. My first job was as a consultant for like 2 years. But after that, I've always been in public service at the local level or at the state level. So doesn't mean someday I won't go back and be a consultant, but there's a lot of important work to do on this side as well.
Katrina, I have to commend you on your knowledge and the way you present things. It's just phenomenal, actually. And for those that look at the podcast, the opportunities that you've talked about are tremendous. And Scott, it just fits so well with what Level is endeavoring, what we're doing.
Yeah. Katrina, thank you so much. Thanks for your hard work. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you guys too.
Thanks for listening. If you found value in this episode, support us by sharing it with someone or leaving a review. In upcoming episodes, we'll discuss the realities of the industry today and what the future may look like. It's our belief that positive changes for architects and engineers is not the obligation of the industry, but rather a choice you make to reimagine how we work together. We invite you to join us in creating a world in which design professionals thrive. Learn about our mission and get involved by following us wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribing to our newsletter at leveldesignpartners.com.